Welcome to What Would You Choose? Your daily dose of fun choices. UFO versus satellite. Which one orbits Earth? Rabbit versus hedgehog. Which one has long ears? Eagle versus duck. Which one soars high in the sky? Snowman versus pumpkin. Which one is made during winter? Dragon versus ghost. Which one breathes fire in stories? Ice skates versus skis. Which one has blades? Lego blocks versus paint set. Which one do you use to build things? Snail versus rabbit. Which one moves slower? Volcano versus mountain. Which one can erupt? Sneakers versus boots. Which one do you wear for sports? Rooster versus peacock. Which one wakes you up in the morning? Moon versus star. Which one changes shape in the sky? Watermelon versus pineapple. Which one has a green outside and red inside? Juice box versus soda cup. Which one is healthier for kids? Flamingo versus chick. Which one stands on one leg? Orange juice versus green tea. Which one is for kids? Hedgehog versus rat. Which one has spines? Shark versus pufferfish. Which one has sharp teeth? Box versus backpack. Which one do you take to school? Cupcake versus ice cream. Which one melts in the sun? Lizard versus scorpion. Which one has a stinger? Cap versus top hat. Which one is more casual? Kangaroo versus elephant. Which one carries a baby in its pouch? Popcorn versus chocolate. Which one is eaten during movies? Tornado versus rain. Which one spins fast in the sky? Camel versus horse. Which one lives in the desert? Egg versus chicken leg. Which one comes first? Brick versus log. Which one is made from clay? Cricket versus ladybug. Which one makes chirping sounds? Fairy versus wizard. Which one has wings? Sunglasses versus gloves. Which one protects your eyes? Drum versus piano. Which one has keys? Subway train versus airplane. Which one travels underground? Parachute versus balloon. Which one helps you land safely? Squirrel versus bear. Which one climbs trees to find nuts? Bed versus bathtub. Which one do you sleep in? Cheese versus bread. Which one is made from milk? Crab versus octopus. Which one has claws? Peacock versus rooster. Which one has colorful tail feathers? Book versus TV. Which one do you read? Thanks for watching. Please subscribe Scene Doll Kids for more Would You Rather quizzes like that.